Thinking aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove, back again with Dr. Edith Fiore, discussing advanced techniques of depossession therapy. Welcome again, Edie.
Hi, nice to be here again.
Mm-hmm. Let's move right into the topic of cases which are more difficult than the ones we discussed before, where the simple depossession methods just don't seem to work, where there are complications.
All right, after one would try the direct sort of frontal approach of asking the earthbound spirit to leave, and of course you at that point wouldn't have any idea about the identity of the spirit, then you might get into having some clues, either through finger signals or from what the patient actually sees. They might see an old person with them, or they are suddenly remembering a neighbor who died or what have you. Then you might address that person and try to persuade that person to leave. Now, if that doesn't work, then what I like to do is to actually do a regression on the earthbound spirit, of course through this patient who is under hypnosis, to the time of their death. Mm-hmm. The purpose of that is to convince them that their body has died.
This requires, of course, that the earthbound spirit is speaking through the patient and is willing to cooperate.
Well, even so, it seems that the patient can tune into their memory banks, mm-hmm. the other's memory banks, so that I never seem to have any problem with that. Mm-hmm. Like I will say, well, go back to the moment of your death, and I count to say 5 or 10. Mm-hmm. And then at that point, the patient will say, I'm thinking of a car accident, or I'm feeling like I'm on an operating table. In other words, it's as though they can tune into each other's mind. In this case, one of them is tuning into the memory bank, hopefully of the possessing earthbound spirit. Right. Then after I know how the person died, it gives me a little bit more ammunition, so to speak, in working with the spirit. I could say, well, you see, you died of a heart attack. You were in the hospital, and I might even mention the name of the hospital, and that sort of jars them, catches their attention, which is one of the major things I want mm-hmm. to do. And then I proceed with the usual technique of convincing them to go.
What it seems as if is going on now then is that the possessing entity is in a sort of a hazy state, not totally aware of why they're there. They're just kind of glomming on.
That's exactly it, and they may not even realize that their body has died. That's about one of the major reasons that they stay around, because mm-hmm. they really aren't convinced of that. Oh, another thing that
they're in a dreamlike state, so to
sometimes they're just not aware that I'm talking to them, but if they hear Miami General Hospital or whatever, their ears perk up because it rings a familiar bell. Now, if that doesn't work, one of the things that I do before that is that in order to convince them that they're in somebody else's body, I will hold up a mirror and ask the patient to open up their eyes, and then I'll tap them on the head and I'll say to the spirit, you can feel me touching the head. I don't say your head because it's not their head, but look into the mirror. That's not your face, is it? And then sometimes for the very first time, they'll recognize that no, it's not their face. I may have also gotten this information from the patient, that they may say, well, at times when I look in the mirror, I really feel freaked out because it feels like it's not me. Mm-hmm. So I will also say, now feel the breast, and I will have mm-hmm. the patient.
Watch the microphone there.
I have the person put their hands on the breast if it's a mm-hmm. woman, and I'll say, if it's a male, you see you're in a body with breasts. Mm-hmm. Or if it's a female possessing a male, look, where are your breasts? And so forth. In other words, to really bring home the point that they're in somebody else's body.
Mm-hmm. Of course, they may full well know that they're in someone else's body.
Yes. Now, if they're hiding, which sometimes is the case, then I will do a regression on the patient to the moment that the earthbound spirit joined them. Now, that throws a lot of light on where they were. For instance, if they're in a hospital, again, I can use that in addressing the earthbound spirit. Also, usually at that point, the patient can begin to describe the earthbound spirit. It's an old lady who was in the bed next to me, or mm-hmm. it's my mother, or whatever.
In other words, the more information you can get about the circumstances that are involved here, then you feed that information back to the patient and presumably the possessing entities, and that helps to awaken them to the reality of the situation.
That's exactly it. Now, in some cases, if we can't let's say that the session has to stop at that point, it helps the patient to realize where they stop and where the other one starts. That yes, indeed, their tiredness is not their tiredness, but it's because they had that old lady who died in the hospital bed or in the house or whatever with them. And maybe we can't convince her to go with that particular session, but it helps to differentiate the two in the patient's mind, and therefore they get more and more control over their own consciousness.
You know, I should think a lot of therapists at this point might say, you know, if you go and tell your patient who came to you as a normal neurotic, and now they think not only am I neurotic, but I'm possessed, that they may worry about being possessed, and that could make things worse for them.
It doesn't seem to. In fact, it's a relief, because they will say to me in the initial interview, it's just not me. I scream and yell just before my period. My husband says I'm like a different person. Now it all begins to click in place. And of course, I prepare them for this by talking to them before we even start the depossession. Another thing that's very helpful about differentiating the two, even at this stage, which I consider a rather light form of depossession, before we get to the heavier weight of depossessions, is that if there's an addiction, say to cocaine or chocolate or alcohol or something of the sort, if the patient knows that it's not really they themselves who want this, but the other person, then they can say no. So that if there's a craving for chocolate, they can say, well, if you want chocolate, go and get it on the other side. I'm not going to give you the chocolate anymore. If they think that they want the chocolate or they want the alcohol or the cocaine, then they're going to buckle under, and then that perpetuates the possession, because the earthbound spirit is getting what they stayed here for. If it gets uncomfortable for them, they want the alcohol, and they're not getting it, and I've told them that their loved ones are here showing them their favorite drink, then they're more apt to go. Now that's a sort of a secondary level of depossession.
The carrot and stick
Yes,
method.
exactly. Now, one step deeper than that is when, now if all of those efforts fail, then the next step down, which would be about the third level, would be that we look into the ties, the past life ties between the two people. Perhaps unwittingly, these two souls, and when I say unwittingly, I mean at a personality level, because I imagine the whole thing is planned, they have come together because of a deep connection. I have found such things tying people together, that one may have saved the other's life, and now they feel an indebtedness to take care of this earthbound spirit. There may be a vengeful motive. Perhaps the patient killed the earthbound spirit, that personality, in a former lifetime, and with that they're even realizing that there's an anger and they're going to hang in there to get even with them. Conversely, a great way to get even with an earthbound spirit is to keep them earthbound, so they're not going into the light and being free. So we go back to whatever the connection was in a past life by doing a simple past life regression.
On the entity?
On the bond. I would have the patient, the way I would word it would be, now going into your memory banks, go back to the very event in the past life that's responsible for this connection, because it could be that they were together in many lifetimes, and I don't particularly want to spend the time exploring either miscellaneous lifetimes or miscellaneous events in those lifetimes. So I will say to go to the very event that's responsible for this possession or this bond. Then now if that fails, then, if we find, just to back up a bit, if we find that, for instance, the earthbound spirit was killed by the patient, then they may feel righteous indignation and they can hang in there because that's their just due. But then I go back a couple more lifetimes to when they themselves killed the other, so that we can see that this has been alternating. Maybe we have to go into 4 lifetimes when one has been the bad guy, the other the victim, and so forth and so on. And then by this point, they're both ready to say, let's forget it, and the earthbound spirit goes into the light very readily.
So this can be a very complicated and involved process at this point.
It can at this point, but this is very unusual. I would say that 90 to 95% of earthbound spirits go with a simple, one-time, persuasive depossession, if it's well done, as outlined in our last talk. Now, the last thing that I would do would be, and fortunately I've never had to go beyond this because I don't know exactly what else we would do to help the situation, is to go to the patient's need to be possessed. And we find then that after a death, and would go to the specific event responsible for their need to be possessed, that they possess somebody, maybe willingly, maybe to hurt that person, or maybe out of their fear or their confusion. So it's as though this is their karmic debt.
In a past lifetime.
In a past lifetime, let's say that...
Or in between past lifetimes.
Yes, let's say that Anne is possessed.
All right.
All right. Let's say that there doesn't seem, and I put that word in quotes, to be any connection with her possessor. We will go to why it is that she needs to be possessed in order to release that as a symptom. We might find that Anne in a past life was say a child who died and was very terrified of going and possessed the mother, and therefore caused great misery to the mother. Perhaps a child died of an illness and then brought the imprint of that illness into the mother's etheric body and then filtering down to the physical, or at least confuse the issue.
Let me stop you for a second. Could you define etheric body?
Right. As I see it, the etheric body is an exact duplicate, cell by cell, organ by organ, of our physical bodies. It's an invisible, very fine, interpenetrating body. But apparently, if something interferes with that, and it has the blueprint of all that goes on in our physical body, if the two etheric bodies, in other words, the possessor and the possessee's etheric bodies mingle, and then the possessor brings in an ailment, that is going to start affecting the etheric body of the patient. Unless it's a very, very strong constitution, then the person could begin to have actually kidney infections and heart problems and even cancer. These sorts of things I've seen. It affects the hormonal system with hot flashes and all kinds of symptoms of this order. So that to get back to what we were talking about before, the karmic bond or the karmic need to be possessed has to be explored. And then usually after that, if that doesn't work, I have come to the conclusion, since I don't have any more aces up my sleeve, that it is a karmic situation that I cannot change. And I've had a couple of cases, and one that comes to mind immediately, in which I did everything that I could possibly do, and the patient and I agreed that this was a karmic situation and that she just had to lead her life the best she could with this burden. And in this case, it was a very, very negative. She was a woman, a male suicidal entity who was practically causing her to overdose once a month at least. And what happened is I told her that she was basically a very normal person and would wake up one day freed of this. And I really don't feel it was a hypnotic suggestion, because we had worked together for almost 5 years. And one day, indeed, she woke. She prayed heavily for 3 days, and then one day she woke up and he was gone. And she was totally clear-minded.
As if she had put her time in?
That's it. That's it. So that if we can't affect a cure, then it's as though there are many forces beyond our understanding.
Now, there are also cases where it's as if the possessing entity is itself also possessed.
Yes, I had a case today that I'd like to tell you about. I saw a man for the third time today, a very brilliant man who is absolutely about as non-functional as you can be outside of a hospital. He's a brilliant man. He was a law student. He had to drop away from that. He had a series of nervous breakdowns, and he is working just as a janitor in an institution where they're taking care of his boarding care, religious order. Now, he came in today, and under hypnosis, we got in touch with the fact that I regressed him to the day of his father's death. Something had told him to ask me to do this. I did this, and immediately he reverted back to being a 2-year-old child. He's of Spanish-speaking origins, speaking first in English and then reverting to Spanish. Unfortunately, I understood Spanish, saying, "Father, don't go, you're dead, I can't stand this, we're going to be so poor, how will we survive?" And then pleading with whole body racking sobs for the father not to go.
As only a 2-year-old could do.
Yes. "Don't go, Papa. Papa, don't leave me. Don't leave the family. We'll all die. How will we survive? There won't be food. Stay, Papa, stay." And then all of a sudden he became very calm. The tears were streaming down his face, and I felt at that moment that the father had stayed. And then the patient's name is not Jose, but the voice said, "I am Jose." And interestingly enough, the patient and I had wondered whether a possessing entity who he'd picked up in his home country in South America could learn English through all these years. And I said, I didn't think so, but apparently he had. And he said, "I am Jose, and I didn't mean to harm my son." Anyway, what came out is that the father, in the last year of his illness, the father had had a wonderful temperament, but in the last year of his illness, he turned into a terrible tyrant, had temper tantrums and screamed and yelled at everybody. He was possessed because of the physical weakness that he was experiencing. His aura was weak. He picked up one or more possessing earthbound spirits who completely changed his personality. When he joined his son at age 2, the boy was 2 years and 1 month. He brought himself to help the son and to help the family, but he brought along the possessing entities. At the very end, he we both spoke to him in Spanish and persuaded him to go into the light. But the father. But I asked the father before he went to definitely make sure that the others left. And I think that he left, we got the very strong feeling that he was definitely going to go. And at that point he was struggling to get the earthbound spirits, these very nasty types, to leave. Now, interestingly enough, this boy had been an angel until his father's death. And from his father's death on, he was such a terrible terror. Had so many temper tantrums that his mother would have to take him outside and dump him upside down in a rain barrel of cold water in order to bring him to his senses. He was just flailing around and demanding, and he was just a total brat.
A conventional therapist might say at this point that that was the cause of his troubles.
Well, he was a brat before he was dumped in the water. Is that what you mean? But the thing is, we will never know.
Right.
We can never prove any of this. But I suspect that the next time I see this person, he will be cured.
So
I would not be surprised.
the method then involves, in this case, talking to the possessing entity and learning from the possessing entity his own history of having been possessed.
If that's the case. The father volunteered that. In this case, it was really a simple depossession, and it started by our doing a regression to the death of the father, because the man had been guided for several days, knowing he was going to see me. He was very nervous and thinking about the session, and really felt that he needed to go back to that particular day. He said, I want to go back to December 16th, 1947. And I thought, this is an unusual request. Why? And he said, that's the day of my father's death. I know down deep something happened. We had been talking about possession. He had been listening to the depossession tapes. But when he worked through the pleading, because you see, he was subconsciously hanging on to his father. And after this, he went through the pleading with his father to stay. He released all of that.
He was able to let go of it.
Yes. And then he told his father in an adult voice, no longer the young boy screaming and crying and pleading, that he really wanted the father to go, that he was a grown man now, and he could take care of himself. And then the father spoke in a very different voice, a lower voice, and announced that he was Jose, and that he didn't mean to harm his son. And then there was a lot of asking of forgiveness back and forth, which I felt that they needed to do. Now, this is not ordinary. Usually I don't get into the forgiveness theme. But in this case, the boy had to ask forgiveness because he'd kept the father earthbound all these years, and the father had, because of the other spirits that had possessed him, had ruined this young man's life.
Now, I realize this is very difficult to map out, but when the father died, he himself was possessed.
Yes, he had been possessed for a year, he said.
Presumably, these spirits were possessing his etheric body or something of that sort. And so when the father then came into his son, these possessing spirits, where were they?
All right, they were all together. They did not leave the father. They did not, to begin with, they were earthbound spirits. They had no intention of leaving. So just because their host, the father, died, they did not go automatically into the light. He was all set to go into the light.
Yes.
He was on his way when the boy pleaded and screamed and yelled and pleaded with him to stay, because they were very poor and there were many people, and the boy didn't realize what he was saying. He wanted his father to be alive. He wasn't asking for the spirit to stay. He was asking for his father not to die. His father was already dead.
Yes.
But he was just not recognizing that, only being 2 years old or whatever. So therefore, when he asked the father to stay, the father's spirit stayed and actually incorporated in his physical body, the son's physical body, and along came his possessors. So I don't know how many there were, whether there was just two, the father and one possessor of the father, or whether there was more than one.
But you worked with the father then to help these nasty types, as you described them.
I never talked to them. And probably they would still be not speaking English, because the father was a very intelligent man. So he, at that point, was going to see to it, he was struggling at that point to get them to go, because what happens to people when they're under hypnosis is that they can often clairvoyantly see what's going on. So my patient was saying that my father is struggling with them to leave, so I got the feeling there was more than one. And then he himself said something about getting them to, I asked him to, I said, you can do one last thing for your son, and that is to take these people with you or hand them over to their loved ones who are there. And then my patient said the same thing in Spanish to reinforce it.
I see. Well, now there's also a level at which sometimes these earthbound entities seem to participate in activities of humans, such as, for example, cursing.
Oh yes, cursing is very interesting. I have had a number of cases in the last couple of months, in which all of a sudden everything goes wrong in the person's life. They usually have all kinds of physical ailments that can be verified through medical channels, but maybe they don't know why they have this particular problem. Everything goes wrong. Things go wrong in their life. One woman was studying for, another one started studying for the bar exam and was in a home where there was apparently some problem, and then it seems that there was a curse put on her. With many others, there are curses that are done deliberately with people who are into witchcraft, others who just hate the person and with a great deal of vehemence curse that person. Now, what I think happens at this point is that earthbound spirits are mobilized by higher echelon negative spirits who are not earthbound entities. They're of a different caliber.
Demonic sorts.
Yeah. They use this curse and the energy wrapped up, and they take these kind of army of earthbound spirits, and they may have them possess a person in order to bring about a certain ailment. I'm not exactly sure how that works. The way I've gotten this information is by doing regressions on people to times when they abuse their psychic powers. In the case of somebody who, quote, needed, unquote, to be possessed, we would often find them very skilled in psychic development in a past life in which they cast a spell on somebody and they deliberately, more or less sicked an earthbound spirit on somebody else, causing them to be crippled or to be sick or to be just, maybe even to commit suicide. They might take a suicidal earthbound spirit and have that person possess a perfectly normal person, only to have that person commit suicide because of the demands of the earthbound spirit to keep killing themselves over and over. So that when they employ those forces, of course it's going to rebound on them later. But that's how I understand how some of these curses work. Now, I'm not sure whether all curses work this way, but there's definitely a ritual that can be done to undo this, and perhaps in some other time we can go into that.
Well, why don't we take a moment now?
Oh, okay. I have the person who is cursed visualize the person who cursed them, and to see them connected with very disgusting bonds. Maybe they're black ropes dripping with slime, or very heavy rusty chains. And then they have a laser-like weapon in their hand. They press a button and out comes a brilliant white light, and they sever the bonds, every single one, little tiny ones, big yucky ones, big heavy ones. And as they sever each one, they think, I release you to your highest good. And I release you to your highest good. And they see that person there in front of them, and they release them. And that seems to get rid of the spell. I was going to say dispel the spell. In other words, also to see these chains or these connections as being pulverized. So there's no leakage of what we call psychic energy. There's no wound that's left behind, no scarring. It's not like cutting an umbilical cord that would bleed. It's like all of a sudden it's no longer there. And it really has a very, very liberating effect. Many people who have been cursed for as long as, say, 40 years feel free for the first time. Now, whether it's all subconscious, they feel free, so therefore they are, or whether something is actually going on, I don't know.
But it's the use of imagery. If a person feels cursed, they can, it's like using a magical sword.
Yes, and interestingly enough, many times it's taken a year after the therapy has started for them to say, you know, I've been meaning to tell you something. Just before all this happened, somebody cursed me. Now I start asking these questions. I'll say, was anybody very angry with you, or did something go wrong? Was somebody jealous of you, or somebody really have it in for you? It's sort of it's really a psychic attack. And they will say that somebody actually physically cursed them, or sent them a letter cursing them, or they suspect that somebody did because the person was involved in witchcraft or some kind of occult practices, and maybe had even bragged of putting spells on other people. As you know, it's very, very common in Brazil and other countries.
In the Philippines,
yes.
In Africa, it's a way of life.
And of course in Italy and Greece, and they even wear little talismans to ward off the evil eye.
Well, one gets a sense that in our so-called Western industrialized democracies, these sorts of things are just superstitious vestiges, but certainly at a subconscious level, even the most rational of people may be affected by it.
Yes, and what I generally have to do, if the curse is not lifted, then I'll go into the past life connection, or the guilt, that why does this person accept this curse? It's because there's something that they feel guilty about in connection with the person cursing them, and often we have to go into past life to find this out. We'll find a jealousy from the past life, or maybe even the hatred carrying forward. of the person who's doing the cursing may have hated that person tremendously for some real, supposedly justified insult or situation from a past life. And so therefore, the slightest provocation from the current life triggers this curse, which is an overreaction.
Well, we're getting very close here now to an area which you've described to me as being beyond that which you're comfortable going, and which would be sort of the demonic.
Yes. Now that I don't deal with directly, but if there's a curse going on, what I would imagine is happening is that there may be negative forces that are orchestrating what happens in terms of if there's a possessor sent to a person, which ones get sent and why. There's an awful lot that we don't know.
Right. But what I'm hearing you say is that as cases come into your office or are likely to come into the office of any therapist, that the vast majority of them, if they deal with possession or if they deal with cursing or possession within possession, these are things that using these basic therapeutic techniques and an openness to the possibility of these spiritual realities you can deal with.
Oh, definitely. People can change their lives, like the man that I saw today who was possessed by his father, who in turn had been possessed by others. I feel that the next time I see him, his whole life will be completely different. That he's been experiencing tremendous bouts of anxiety and really so crippled that he can't accomplish anything in his life. And I feel that this is now, he's going to be freed from this.
Well, you're used to seeing this after thousands of clients, that when you reach the key spiritual situation in their life and you address it, that you see rapid change.
Instantaneous. At that moment, there's a change, generally speaking.
Well, I think that speaks very highly for your method, regardless of how one is going to view the metaphysics of it all.
Yes, we don't really have to believe in all of these things. The tools work, and the techniques work. And we're all in this to help other people to get well, to be whole, to be free.
Well, Dr. Edith Fiore, it's once again been a pleasure to share this time.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey.
Thank you for being with me.
You're welcome.
And thank you for being with us.